evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. Welcome to Atlanta History Center's virtual author talk series. My name is Claire Haley, and I'm Vice President of Public Relations and Programs here for the History Center. And I'm just so thrilled to be welcoming our special guest, William Neuman, this evening. His new book, Things Are Never So Bad That They Can't Get Worse Inside the Collapse of Venezuela, was just out last week. So if you have not yet purchased your copy of the book that we'll be discussing this evening, it is available for purchase from Atlanta History Center's online museum store, 25% off tonight only. And you can pick that up in our store if you're local, or we'll ship it to you as long as you live in the domestic United States. It is just such a rich investigation of the topic that we're going to barely be able to get into this evening. So if tonight's talk intrigues you, trust me, there's very much more that's in the book. As we talk this evening, if you do have any questions for William, please submit those into the Q&A. We'll try our best to weave those through as we go. So if we're talking about a topic that's very interesting to you and you have a question about it, feel free to submit it then. If you think of it at the end, that's okay too. We'll save about 15 minutes at the end and try to get to as many of those questions as we can. So I'm going to briefly introduce tonight's guest, and then he is going to begin with a short reading from the book. So again, our guest is William Neuman. He is an author and journalist who reported for the New York Times for over 15 years. He served as the Times Andes Region Bureau Chief from 2012 to 2016 while based in Caracas. And he previously reported for the New York Post. He's been featured in many other publications, including the San Francisco Chronicle, the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and the Independent. He began his journalism career while living in Mexico, and he's also published English translations of several Spanish language novels. So William, thank you again for joining us virtually, and I'll turn it over to you for tonight's reading.
Thank you very much, Claire. Thank you to the Atlanta History Center, and it's a great pleasure to be here. And thanks to everybody who is in the audience. So I'm going to do a short reading from the book. The book obviously is about what happened in Venezuela, and the focus is on the last several years of this epic economic and social collapse. And one of the things when I was reporting on the book in 2019 is that there were these massive nationwide blackouts where the power went out all across the country and would stay out for days at a time. And that it was became sort of a symbol of the decay of the country. And so I'm going to read a passage from when I was there after a series of long blackouts. So people were very much fed up, and they were also dealing with all sorts of other things like shortages of food and medicine, and people had no running water in their homes. They didn't have gas to cook with. They had to get online in their cars to buy gasoline. So that's the backdrop for what I'm going to read. And when I was there was a protest going on in this one small neighborhood where power had been out for several days, and everybody else had power around them, but they didn't. And they got fed up, and they lived near the road to the airport. And so they went out and they barricaded the road with tree branches. The problem was that since there were no flights going in, even though this was the second largest city in the country, there was maybe 1 or 2 planes a day that came in. There was almost no traffic to barricade. But at any rate, people were desperate. And this is sort of an expression of their desperation. So I'll read a short passage. And this was at night when I get out there and they blocked the road. It was too dark for me to write in my notebook, so I used a recorder. It preserved a jumble of desperate overlapping voices. The only light came from the floodlights, powered by a generator, in the parking lot of a hotel on the airport road. It was called Hotel Aeropuerto. The parking lot was empty, a black rectangle under a black sky. No flights, no guests. I spoke with a man named Alejandro Delgado. He was a criminal lawyer. Between cases, he drove a taxi. You feel powerless, he said. He was talking about the disruptions to their lives, the arbitrariness of electricity's coming and going, of the uncertain water supply. It robbed you of your sleep. That was the worst. Normally, you slept with the air conditioner on, but without power in the heat of Maracaibo, you had to leave the windows open or sleep outside. And the mosquitoes wouldn't leave you alone. You could wrap yourself up in a sheet, but then you felt like you were suffocating and still you couldn't sleep. On top of all that, you were on edge all the time. You were worried about your family, your neighbors, and you were always ready to wake up in the middle of the night if the lights came on or the water came on. If you finally fell asleep, it was like you were sleeping with one eye open. This is not a life with dignity, Alejandro said. A man listening to us broke in. We're the Walking Dead here. They're killing us slowly, Alejandro said. We're like zombies, said a short, wiry woman with thin, bare arms. Her words came out in angry, repetitive bursts. They're killing us. No food, no electricity. We're going to disappear any day now. Look, sometimes you get up and your stomach is flat against your spine. Maybe you could afford to buy some rice, but nothing to go with it. Or maybe some corn flour, but then you make arepas and there's nothing to put in them. They're starving us to death. So what does that make us? Zombies, zombies, zombies. No one is obese here. We're all skinny. Alejandro said, you get up from the table and you're already thinking about tomorrow. What am I going to eat tomorrow? The agitated woman who talked about zombies was named Xiomara Jaime. You're having your arepa for breakfast, she said, and you're already thinking, what am I going to make for lunch? You've got rice because you bought some, okay. And what about meat or chicken, salad, soup? Chicken, salad, cheese, Alejandro said. They were like old people remembering the names of vanished, outdated products that they hadn't seen since childhood. Nothing. Xiomara said that she'd always been with the opposition, always against Chavez and now against Maduro. Alejandro had a soft, thoughtful voice. Spoke slowly. I don't consider myself on one side or the other, he said. I applaud the good things and criticize the bad things. We took a walk through the neighborhood. They all knew one another, greeted one another. The houses were modestly middle class. The homes of government workers, professionals, office workers. Nothing fancy, but you could see even in the dark that life had been good here in an unpretentious, hardworking way. Some houses had torches burning in front, crooked sticks with a black can on the end containing a rag soaked in diesel fuel with a flame leaping out. They gave off a fluttering, moth-like light. Alejandro said that the streaky black smoke helped keep away the mosquitoes, which came in swarms from a creek behind the houses. At the end of the street, there was a gray cinder block wall. It was too high to see over, but on the other side was the hotel that I'd noticed from the barricade. The glow of light produced by its generators crowned the wall like an aurora, like the glow of a distant city that you might see while driving across the plains at night. It gave off light, but it didn't illuminate. And that's the reading.
Thank you for that, William. And I loved how, well, not loved, but it made an intriguing storyline throughout the book, how you framed the Blackout story, throughout the book as a way of showing the very human side of the collapse, because there's just something about a country that is sitting on so much wealth underground, so much oil wealth, not having electricity. It seems that most basic component for an industrialized nation. It's really powerful.
But well, you sort of have to follow the reporting. So I didn't anticipate that, obviously. And so it just became such a big theme and such a powerful symbol throughout that year. And the power kept going out and kept going out. And it became such a big part of people's lives that it sort of becomes a spine in the book as you go through it. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, it governs what they're able to do, when and how. So it just becomes this unpredictable force by which folks are forced to live their lives. But as you go into the book, it wasn't always this way. So Venezuela, has such a rich and long history, having been the birthplace of the revolution that got it out of Spanish control hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Through to the 20th century, where again was sitting on enormous wealth. Once oil was discovered, you compare it to that opening scene in the Beverly Hillbillies, where there's the oil just glutting out of the ground. Right. That's literally what happens in some parts of Venezuela. So it's hard to imagine, how you go from that, especially during the 70s when oil prices were so high, to what you're describing. So in the opening pages of the book, you describe the rifts that became exposed following Chavez's election, initially in 1998. You said that they had causes that were historical, but the rift deepened with him. He mined and encouraged it until it became a part of the landscape. And you also initially described Venezuela as the shouting country, where you see people yelling across the street at each other, but they're ignoring the potholes and chasms that are opening up in the middle. You later kind of revise that initial sentiment, but what is it that gave you that initial impression of the country?
Well, that was one of the things that very early on I came to see. And I was actually talking earlier today with a Venezuelan friend, and she also mentioned that same passage in the book. And one of the things, Venezuelans are very voluble, happy, loud people in general. And it's common to go, I remember oftentimes we'll go to somebody's house and it'll be a Sunday afternoon. I'll have a Sunday lunch, and the Sunday lunch, will start at noon and go until 11 p.m. And I've been at some of these, gatherings with a whole bunch of people sitting around, and I'll just realize that everybody is talking at the same time and everybody is shouting. And these are people who are all friends and getting along. The problem is that when you take that into the political realm, and there's ways that Venezuela and the experience there is a cautionary tale for the United States, because the kind of polarization that we see here now has been the case in Venezuela for quite some time. And so I would I would often go out on doing reporting in the street, and I never had a problem, almost never had a problem with people. People were always willing to talk to me. But, they would get all agitated and they would just start talking loudly and shouting. And that's, partly just how people are. But I just came to see that extends itself to the political realm. And so they would just wanted to express themselves and shout. And the division was pro-Chavez, because Chavez is the president, or anti-Chavez. And that became the country. And everybody just wanted to shout at the top of their voices their point of view and never listen to the other people. So
it's definitely a powerful point and metaphor. But let's talk about Chavez for a second, because even though your book runs through until almost the present day, and we can talk a little bit about the election that you were just in Venezuela for fairly recently that goes past the events of the book. But as you state, so much of what you explore in the book was really set up by that pro-Chavez, anti-Chavez kind of dynamic and the way that he ran the country. So you alluded to the fact that Venezuela is extremely polarized. Over its history, it's had similar types of polarization, even if it wasn't the same two-sidedness. I mean, you saw revolution was extremely bloody. Simon Bolivar, the national anti-hero at first, at the end of the revolution, dies 46 years old, a pauper, but his memory is resurrected very much in Venezuela. And that's something that Hugo Chavez invokes a lot, the Bolivarian revolution and all these other things. So tell us more about Chavez and first of all, how did he come to power? Because I think that's a fascinating story. And then how did he use this history and this polarization and these ideals to kind of shape what became Chavismo?
Okay. Chavez gets elected. Well, Chavez first comes to the attention of Venezuelans in 1992 because he leads a coup against the democratically elected government. The coup is a failure. Chavez gets arrested, but the country has been, just backing up a little bit more, there was the oil boom of the 70s. We called it the oil crisis. Countries that had oil to sell called it the oil boom. And this huge amount of money flowed into Venezuela, as it did with other oil-rich countries. And there was this great economic boom, but then the boom turned to bust. And by the early 1980s, the country was in recession. And it just started this really long period from the 80s into the 90s of this economic stagnation and a real malaise. And at the same time, the politicians there was a tremendous amount of corruption. The politicians weren't capable of really, leading the country out of this. And so people became very disillusioned with the political parties and with the whole political process. In the middle of all that, Chavez leads this coup, and he becomes famous because the coup fails, but they put him on television to tell the other soldiers to lay down their arms. And he just comes across as this very sort of confident, charismatic young soldier. And people say, oh, well, maybe that's what we need. And so that sort of starts Chavez's career. And ultimately, after a couple of years, he gets out of jail, and then he decides to run for president in 1998. And he runs sort of as a disruptor, as an outsider candidate. And initially, he was given no chance at all. He was seen as a buffoon, a clown, and he ends up winning. And so he becomes president. And the country is still in this economic, a bad economic situation. The oil price at the time that he takes office is less than $8 a barrel. And then Chavez gets very lucky because you have the boom in places like China and India, and the price of oil ends up going to, close to $120 a barrel. And so while Chavez is president, the country just fills up with money from the oil business. So help me out here, Claire. So that's how Chavez comes into the picture.
Yeah.
And then, so then the question of polarization. Chavez comes in, but Chavez is essentially a populist. And what populists do is that they get into power and, well, actually, he's a populist, but he's also the beginning of this wave that we see all around the world now of these autocratic politicians who get elected through democratic means. And then once they're in office, they start to dismantle the democratic system, the checks and balances. They change the election rules so that only they can win future elections, that sort of thing. And so he takes office in '99, just by chance. The other politician who is still a major figure who takes office for the first time in '99 is Vladimir Putin in Russia. But they're part of this wave of autocrats and populists. And what populism tends to do, its main feature is this idea of polarization. You have this charismatic politician leader who establishes this direct connection with what he calls the people. But it turns out that the people isn't all the people, it's just some of the people, the ones who support him. And the rest become the enemy, who are in league with the enemy outside the country. And the idea is you just work that divide and that polarization, and you get everybody worked up on your side and the other people to the enemy. And that's a way to maintain that's how you stay in power. So that's where that polarization comes from that I ended up seeing. And, I get there years later because Chavez comes in '99 and I first came there in 2012. And what I see is, this country that's like two groups of people on opposite sides of the streets yelling at each other.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You have this great quote where you talk about how undoubtedly Chavez was charismatic, right? I mean, that was his televised address, which I thought was so ironic in '92, that one of the notable things about it is that they admitted that he had made a mistake or that they had not been successful, which of course, as you explained through multiple anecdotes later in the book, was almost never to be repeated by his regime. But the other thing you say, yes, he was charismatic, but also high oil revenues by a lot of charisma too.
Right.
So he has this right, but he also has a lot of money that he's able to throw around for the people, which, as you explain, are his people, the people that put him in office. And he also brands this socialism for the 21st century, or the Bolivarian Revolution continued the socialism. So that's going to come up as we talk a little bit more. So could you explain a little more what Chavez's socialism looked like? What did that mean in the context of the way that he ran the country?
Well, what I conclude really is that socialism was a branding for Chavez. It was a marketing tool. There's traditionally these ideas of left, right in Latin America, anti-imperialism, that sort of thing. And a lot of people, their definition of Venezuela and the way they see it now is, it's a socialist country and the problems there are because of socialism. But it never really was. There was never any serious attempt to sort of, to leave market capitalism. It's a capitalist country that, Chavez, part of what Chavez did is he established all these social programs, and he had the money to do it. And all the governments before him also had social programs. They built houses, they built clinics, that sort of thing. But then for a long time, they didn't do much of that because there was no money. Chavez gets this windfall of oil money and he starts spending it. And so he creates all these social programs, educational programs, clinics, builds hospitals. The problem is that he does it all badly. There's never, and that's partly why I call it marketing. There was never there was never serious planning and follow through and management so that you could take all this money and build a sustainable country. and a sustainable series of programs and benefits. It was all just like, oh, we're doing this now. We're going to build a hospital here. They never finished the hospital. The country's full of hospitals that are half built, schools like that. He created this whole series of neighborhood clinics, which operated for a while, and he staffed them with Cuban doctors. And then ultimately it all just decayed and they were abandoned. So, one of the things I say about Chavismo is that basically it rained money. They had all this money and then they spent it, they wasted it, and then they stole it. They stole parts of it. They stole a lot of it. There was a tremendous amount of corruption. My conclusion with Chavez is that just because the leader wears a red t-shirt and says that he's a socialist doesn't make him a socialist.
Mm-hmm. You describe, in addition to all the half-finished structures, just you would go to these towns and there'd just be giant holes in the ground where they had started to dig in to pour a foundation and they just never did. So just gigantic holes in the ground. I think that's the best metaphor for what you're talking about. So let's talk a little bit about how Chavez and his predecessors came into all of that money that they were able to throw around so irresponsibly. So Venezuela is home to the largest known oil reserves in the world. They just keep finding more of it. And that's, stuff that's very close to the surface, very easy to get to. It's an incredible amount of wealth, especially when you have times like the 1970s, as you mentioned, when the oil prices are high. But it can also lead to something that you dig into in the book a little bit called the resource curse, or it's also called Dutch disease. So could you get into a little bit of the economics about how that happens and what you mean when you call it a resource curse?
Sure. Stop me if it gets too technical, but essentially what you have is this pattern that, that economists have identified. And it's when you have some kind of research, like a commodity like natural gas or oil. It was true of Spain in the 16th century with all the gold and silver that came in from the New World. So you get this huge windfall of income from some kind of commodity, natural resource that you sell. And that seems like a great thing, and that should be good for the country. But it creates all these disequilibriums. It basically knocks the economy out of balance, and it ends up creating problems. And you have this pattern where countries, come into this windfall, and then the boom turns into a bust. And by the end of it, the country's in worse shape than when it started. And that happened very clearly in the 1970s, not just in Venezuela, but in a lot of countries. Then it happens again in 2000 when you get this new, in the 2000s, when you get this new oil boom. The problem is a lot of countries who had been through it in the 70s learned some of the lessons and changed the way they acted. Venezuela did not. So what happens was what they call the resource curse, is you get tons of money coming in, and one of the things it does is it raises wages. People have more money. It means that imports become very cheap, and so they start importing lots of stuff, and that hurts the local manufacturing and agriculture, because you can buy stuff cheaper that's coming in from outside. And so the economy sort of comes out of whack. Countries often see this money coming in and they start borrowing money. Venezuela, both in the 70s and under Chavez, just borrowed tremendous amounts of money. And then when the income runs out, because the price ultimately falls again of the oil or whatever it happens to be, then they can't pay their debt. So it's this pattern that happens, and it's very clear in the case of Venezuela, where a good thing, lots of money coming in, turns out to be a bad thing because they don't know how to handle it. And people would, several people would say to me when I was working in Venezuela, this all started in the 70s because we didn't know how to handle all that money that came in. And that set the pattern.
I mean, you say that more money poured into Venezuela in the 1970s than the previous 7 decades combined, just to, give everyone in the audience an idea about the amount of money we're talking about. So it takes, capacity to be able to spend that money and spend it responsibly. And as you outlined, instead of spending it in a way to build up that capacity, they pursued a lot of projects and what you call with the Maduro method later, much later, is tactics, things that are going to have short-term gains, but not necessarily long-term influences. So another topic you hear a lot about with the economics of what happened is inflation in Venezuela. So you see just these crazy, I can't remember what the highest one I saw in your book was, but you see just thousands of percentage, of inflation. And so it's really hard to understand how things get to that point. So we're seeing some inflation in the US, at the moment, we're seeing about 7% or so, and we're all, feeling that, right? So that really puts into perspective what this actually means for ordinary people of, thousands of percentages of inflation. But can you talk about where that cycle of inflation started? Did it start in the 70s, or was that something that we saw in Venezuela beforehand?
Well, that's something that also frequently accompanies what they call the resource curse. In a lot of these countries, when you get this big, all this money coming in, you tend to get higher inflation, partly because, say it's the oil business. Well, now they can pay higher wages in the oil industry, and then the industries around that can pay higher wages. And then there's more money in the economy, and there's more money chasing the goods that are there. And then also you get these bottlenecks because there's so much demand, they can't bring in the products. So there's not enough products and prices go up. But one of the things I wanted to say when we talk about hyperinflation is really, really hard to get your mind around it unless you're there. It's like, what does it mean for inflation to be 300,000% a year? And there were two things going on at the same time, is where you had this immense inflation, and you also had a devaluation of the currency. The currency in Venezuela is called the Bolivar, named after Simon Bolivar, their George Washington, basically. And when I got to Venezuela, the it was approximately 4 bolivars to the dollar. It's hard to make an exact comparison today because the government periodically knocks zeros off of the currency to make it look like things aren't as expensive. But if you put those zeros back on, I think it's gone approximately from 4 bolivars to the dollar to something like 400 trillion bolivars to the dollar. So it's just unimaginable. And it sort of creates all these problems where you're trying to how much does this cost? Oh, wait, they took the zeros off. I can't, it's very complicated math. And in terms of the inflation, you would often see, when it was at its worst, I would see stores raising their prices twice a day. And one of the interesting things too is because one of my thinking about inflation of that type comes from, reading about the 1930s, when in Weimar Germany, people were going around, you see those pictures of a guy with a wheelbarrow full of bills, going out to buy a loaf of bread. And you never saw that in Venezuela in quite that way. You would see enormous amounts of money. But there was also a cash shortage at the same time. And it's always been a very sort of connected digital country. And so there is a lot of, even though it's a poor country, a lot of people have bank accounts, and if not credit cards, at least debit cards. And so what I realized is that it was a plastic hyperinflation. There could be a shortage of cash, and yet prices kept going up because people were paying with bank transfers and, essentially plastic. And the government could deposit, money in people's accounts to pay pensions and wages, and that money didn't actually have to exist in paper form. But so I got off your question was what? How did the hyperinflation start, or?
Yeah, where does that come from? So you answered it's the resource curse.
Well, that's one form of inflation. Yeah. But what happened more recently, the hyperinflation is post Chavez. Under Chavez, actually starting in the 70s, inflation goes up. And by the time I got to Venezuela, there had been it had been something like 20 or 30 years in a row of double-digit inflation, but we're talking like 20 or 30% a year, which is bad, but people were used to that sort of inflation. That was normal. And then Maduro comes in, and you basically had a double crisis. Chavez dies in 2013. He gets cancer and he dies. And he had been the only political leader that a lot of people knew. He sort of dominated the whole scene in the country. And he dies suddenly, and then Maduro becomes president. Maduro was sort of his protege. And that's the political crisis. And then a year later, the price of oil drops. And so the country starts to run out of money. So you have this twin crisis, political and economic. And what Maduro does is he keeps spending money, even though he's got, less money coming in. And it's like if at home there's two breadwinners and one person loses a job, you start spending less. And then the other person loses their job and you really cut back. Well, in Venezuela, it was the opposite. They kept spending more and more money, partly because for political reasons, they, wanted to keep things going. But so when you get that, this extreme deficit spending, that's what causes hyperinflation. So the inflation starts to cycle up when the price of oil drops, and they just keep spending money that they don't have.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about the civil society and the political aspect of all of this, because you brought up it was two crises. It wasn't just economic, it was also a political crisis. Of course, one feeds the other and vice versa. Kind of hard to tell which one came first, but there are chronic economic problems, as we've talked about in Venezuela, and weak political institutions, as you alluded to earlier. When Chavez got in office, he was democratically elected, but he started dismantling systematically those checks and balances that are meant to keep a democratic society running. So then you end up with this really weak central political infrastructure and institutions. And then you get Maduro, who it was Chavez's handpicked successor, but doesn't necessarily have the full support of everyone in that movement. And then you also talk about the relationship between the government owning the oil and the citizenry. So you have a point in the book where you say that there's a client relationship between citizens and their government rather than a citizenship relationship. So can you explain what you mean by that and why that feeds into the political situation?
Sure.
Right now?
That particular thing partly comes from this history of oil in the country. Venezuelans talk about this a lot, and the idea is that essentially the government controls the oil industry. They had very tight control over it up until the 70s. In the 70s, they nationalized the oil industry. In other words, they ran the state oil company. And so the government becomes the center of the economy. That's also one of the reasons why people mistakenly say, oh, it's a socialist country, because the government is so involved in so much of the economy, but it was always that way. And at any rate, so they've got all the money, and so if you're a businessman, essentially what you're doing is looking for government contracts. And if you're a poor person, you're looking for government benefits. And if you're a union, you're looking for the government to hire more workers in a government-owned business or factory. And so you get this sort of client relationship where people have with the government. And, we talk in this country, what people tend to say about welfare is like, oh, people are just looking for handouts, they're lazy. It's not really that kind of situation, because it's sort of part of the national outlook. People just look to the government there to be a much more central part of people's lives. But it can lead to this, to this passivity where people just sort of, one of the ways to look at it is that people looked at their government as an ATM machine, because they always knew that all the money goes into the government and then the government sends it out into the economy. And there were some things that I would encounter in Venezuela that really brought that home to me. There's one anecdote, which I think is in the book, about I was talking to a woman, and when Chavez was running for re-election in 2012, the government was spending huge amounts of money to get the economy really roaring and giving away all sorts of stuff. And they went on this building spree, and they built thousands and thousands of apartment buildings and homes. And so I was in this neighborhood where it was a slum. It was a very poor people, but there were like 3 or 4 new, really nice, solid, small, but very well built cinder block houses in the middle of this. And I talked to one of the women who this house had been built by the government and given to this family. And the woman, they've been living there for a year or two. And the woman, I said, "Oh, it's a nice house they gave you." And she was incensed. She was outraged and says, "How can you say that? Look at it." I was like, "Looks like a nice home to me. It's nicer than all these other shacks that are around you." She said, "They didn't paint it. They gave me a house and they didn't paint it." And I said, "Oh yeah, okay. I see that it's not painted, but well, what did you do about it?" And she says, "Well, I've been going to the ministry and complaining, and they never send anybody." And I said, "Well, why don't you go, do you work? Does your husband work?" "Yeah, they were poor, but they had some money coming in." "Why don't you go buy a couple cans of paint and paint your own house, and you don't have to worry about it?" She's like, "I'm not going to paint my house. It's their job to paint my house." And then there was another time when this was a very sad story, because Maduro was president, and there was this city on the border with Colombia, and when things go bad in Venezuela, they always blame the Colombians. And so there were all these border tensions, and Maduro goes on TV and he says, "Oh, there's all these Colombian drug dealers and paramilitaries coming into the country at this point, and we've located their center, and it's in this neighborhood, and I've ordered the neighborhood destroyed." So that's kind of a big deal. And so I went there as a reporter, and the government had brought in backhoes and bulldozers and was bulldozing people's houses. And I went there and I talked to people, and I got there at night, and they had just had this community meeting where they talked about what they were going to do. And I thought, "Oh, interesting. They're getting organized." And it turned out that it was a neighborhood full of Chavistas. They all were government supporters. And also none of it was true. It wasn't really a center of, smuggling and all this stuff. And so I talked to a guy who was coming out of this meeting, and he said, "Oh my God, they're going to, knock down our houses." And I said, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" And I thought that he was going to say, "Well, we're going to organize, and we're going to go to the government, and we're going to say, we're your supporters. You can't do this to us." And he said, "I just hope they give us another house somewhere else." And that's just a great expression of this idea that, I'm a client of the government. The government may take away my house, but they got to they'll give me a house somewhere else. They gave me the house, but they have to paint it. It's very deeply ingrained in the way of thinking. And it doesn't just sort of apply among poor people. I mean, the business class also has always been oriented towards doing business with the government, because that's sort of the only game in town.
Yeah, it was a really hard thing for me to wrap my brain around, as I was reading, and to understand some of the anecdotes you were giving. I immediately thought of the paint story when you started talking, actually. But talking about the man you were speaking with whose neighborhood was razed, which is just a crazy concept to me entirely. You also talk about, there's some other folks that you profile towards the end of the book who, despite everything, are still supporters, are still Chavismos, right? And there's a one gentleman you talk to who says, "Oh, well, now that we don't have all this junk food in our country anymore," because what he's talking about is the fact that they don't have access to many different types of food. We're all eating lentils, and look, I've lost 15 pounds, and how, we're healthier now. I mean, just this crazy kind of bending of, and this twisting around of the narratives to suit this support. Did you see that in that particular instance of the neighborhood? Like, were people still somehow believing in that cause, or was it more of a resignation that they had just accepted this was going to happen and they would get a new house? Or was it that they were trying to somehow make sense of it to support their ongoing political beliefs?
I think both of those things were going on. I mean, there is this sort of resignation that you often come across. But I didn't find people saying, well, I always voted for Chavez and I voted for Maduro, but now I'm not going to because look what he's doing. And it was completely arbitrary. I mean, these people knew that there wasn't, they hadn't been taken over by Colombian paramilitaries. But I didn't hear people saying, no, we're changing sides. But that was earlier on. That was in probably 2015.
Okay.
Now, I mean, a lot of people have sort of abandoned, not necessarily Chavismo, but certainly Maduro. I mean, Chavez is still, I saw a poll recently where Chavez is still the most popular political figure in the country, from the grave. And none of the other politicians, certainly not Maduro, but none of the opposition people either were polling, I think, over 20% in the poll, and Chavez, I don't know, 50, 60% popularity, something like that.
You mentioned the opposition, so I'd love to talk about that a little bit more. In the US, I was thinking back as I was reading your book and remembering that, yes, at the beginning of the Trump presidency in particular, in the US, we were hearing lots and lots about Venezuela, about Maduro, about sanctions, about all these things, and a lot about the opposition and how, there were riots in the streets and there was going to be, he was going to be overthrown and all of this. And then it all kind of evaporated. And I couldn't honestly remember why. And then as I was reading your book, I remembered the whole episode in 2018, 2019. We can get to that in a second. But so Chavez dies of cancer shortly after re-election in 2012. He dies in 2013. Maduro takes over the government. A couple of years later, you have a pretty pronounced opposition movement that does fairly well, in the polls against Maduro and is unified in a way that maybe they weren't in the past, but there's definitely trust issues amongst those factions. So who are the opposition in Venezuela? And as I was reading your book and you're talking about populism being oriented against something, I was against the other. I couldn't help but think that the opposition, what was unifying them to a certain extent, was being against Maduro. So is there more that binds them together? And what is the opposition? What does that look like?
Sure. But no, that's exactly it, Claire, which is that a lot of the opposition is simply, we're against the government. They were against Chavez, now they were against Maduro. And it's hard for voters to say, well, what are they? The voters are like, well, what are they for? And I had a conversation with Enrique Capriles when I was in Venezuela in November, and he's an opposition politician who ran for president against Chavez and then against Maduro. And he said, it's not enough to be against the dictatorship. You have to offer people something. And that's something that really the opposition has lacked. The opposition, it runs the gamut from, center to center right to center left, essentially. Now, with things sort of completely falling apart, there is a big chunk of people who are in Chavismo who have left and joined the opposition. So now you've got more of a left of center element in the opposition as well. But one of the real weaknesses of the opposition in Venezuela is that it's so personality oriented. Chavez didn't come out of nowhere. Venezuelan politics and much of Latin American politics is about what they call the caudillo, the general on the white horse, or the charismatic figure, or the father figure. So many of Venezuela has lots of small political parties that are all organized by and oriented generally towards one person. And I quote a person in the book saying that these parties really only exist and were created to follow the ambitions of the particular leader. And that ambition is ultimately getting elected president. And that's just a tremendous weakness, because then what you have is that they can't unify because all these leaders are very ambitious and they're all jealous of each other and they don't trust each other. And so they fight more among themselves sometimes than they fight with the government. And that's been a tremendous weakness. And, there was Venezuela was all over the headlines and in the news back in 2019 when Juan Guaido, who's the young legislator declares himself president, and the US comes out and recognizes him as the legitimate president. Lots of other countries do too. And there's this brief sort of spasm in the country where, what's going to happen? Is Maduro going to fall? And one of the things that I discovered is that, obviously that didn't happen, but Guaido was undermined by all of that lack of trust. And part of the lack of trust, he fed it as well, because while Guaido is part of this tiny party led by a guy named Leopoldo Lopez, who is one of the least trusted among all the opposition folks internally, and they were telling their friends in the opposition that they weren't going to go ahead and do something as radical as declaring Guaido president. And at the same time, they were talking to the State Department and the White House saying that's what they were going to do. And so, the people realized that, and they were taken by surprise by the whole Guaido thing. So there's a tremendous amount of difficulty and infighting. And in the most recent elections in November, they could have won governorships in a dozen states, but they ran multiple candidates because they couldn't agree on a single candidate. And so the opposition candidates in total got the majority of the votes, but the Chavista candidate won because, they split the vote. So that's been their real problem all along.
And Guaido is such a fascinating figure because he kind of, at first, almost comes out of nowhere, to be this right. leader, if you were to call it that, of the opposition. Later, as you say, declares himself interim president and took a lot of folks by surprise who were supposed to be his allies. And I was wondering if you could briefly talk about what you call aptly the Bay of Piglets, which really made me laugh, and what basically was this plan, if you can even call it a plan, a semblance of a plan, to somehow overthrow the Maduro government by using mercenaries that just gets completely bungled. And if anything, ends up feeding Maduro's conspiracy theories about the United States meddling in Venezuela. This part of what he uses, that anti-US sentiment to stay in power. It's also called the Macuto Screwup. So could you tell us a little more about what happened there? And as you do, just really quick, if anyone has any questions for William, go ahead and drop those in the Q&As. We're getting towards the end of our time.
Well, Guaido sort of emerges, as you say, out of nowhere. Essentially nobody knows who he is. He's a young guy. He's a backbencher in Congress. But because of a set of circumstances, he emerges as the one who declares himself president. And that's in January 2019. And then there's a couple of attempts. The problem is that there's never a plan there. It's just, I'm going to declare myself president. The US will recognize me, and then something will happen and Maduro will go away. And that's not, nothing happened and Maduro didn't go away. And that's why people got disillusioned with Guaido fairly quickly. And so that happens. He emerges in January. There's a couple sort of failed attempts to sort of get something together, pressure Maduro, that never really come together. And so by April, the air's gone out of the Guaido thing, and people stop coming out to protest, and he really runs out of steam. And so then he and Leopoldo Lopez, who's the head of his party, get in touch with an operative in Miami, and they say, let's see if we can hire somebody to come in and take out Maduro. And so this guy ends up cutting a deal with another person who comes out of nowhere, Jordan Goudreau, who had been a Green Beret, and then started his own security company, which, really never had any business. But for whatever strange series of reasons, they hire him and they sign a very elaborate, very long contract with him to invade their country and take away Maduro. The thing is that Goudreau has no experience that would qualify him to do that or make anyone think that he could pull it off. This sort of peters along for months, somewhat in secret. And then suddenly was it May of 2020, this boatload of of armed men appears in a tiny little port in a place near Caracas called Macuto, and they're all killed by the army. And then the next day, another boatload, including 2 American Green Berets, not Goudreau, but 2 of his friends, is captured and taken prisoner. And then the whole thing comes out because Goudreau is still in Florida, and it all comes out that they had signed this contract with this guy. And one of the people I talked to says that, they even tried to outsource that, getting rid of Maduro. So it was just like a series of, it was Keystone Cops. It was just no real planning, no follow through. And then, this absurdity that happened at the end. And unfortunately, these 2 Green Berets are in prison in Venezuela. And, there's no indication that, they got roped into it by their friend Jordan, and there they are.
Yeah, and they're paying the consequences for
Yes.
that. I feel like we've touched a lot on the economics, the civil society piece and everything, but can you put into context, so Maduro, as you discuss in the book, implements a lot of the characteristics that you see of authoritarian leaders around the world, including, repression, violence, spying on citizens. Can you talk about how his regime has differed from Chavez and those tendencies that we've seen? Do you think that's more of a result of the bottoms falling out because of all the things that we talked about? So it's hanging on to the grip, like Chavez, who had those tendencies, didn't have to do as much of that because he had so much money, or where do you think that comes from?
That's exactly what it was. Chavez had a handful of political prisoners. Maduro's got a couple of hundred. Chavez didn't really need a lot of repression because he had money. He needed money to throw around. And Maduro has no money, and he's under a tremendous amount of pressure, and he's also not as talented a politician as Chavez. So he made a choice, which was to become more authoritarian. Chavez also was popular enough where he could win elections. Maduro, in order to get himself reelected, essentially had to throw, some politicians in jail, disqualify others from running against him. He manufactures this scenario where anybody who had the people who had the most likely ability to beat him in an election were unable to run, either because they were in jail or out of the country or forced out of the country or disallowed by the courts from running. He changes the whole electoral calendar and does things that are, technically that were illegal in terms of how the election was organized, and basically gets the opposition to decide to boycott the election. I believe that if they had, in a unified way, run a candidate against Maduro in 2018, they could have beaten him. I think it directly comes out of, we have to make him responsible for it. So it comes out of his personality and his way of thinking. But it's also a product of not having money to spend to buy people off. And, the prosperity is a different thing.
Mm-hmm. You leave off in the book in early 2020, I believe, shortly after the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. But as we were discussing briefly earlier, you had the chance to go back to Venezuela somewhat recently, first time since the pandemic set in. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you saw. Are we still getting worse, or do you think that things might be stabilizing, or what are you seeing now?
Things got worse and worse and worse. But eventually they have to start, they don't have to, but, essentially they've had 8 years of economic contraction. They lost 80% of the GDP. And it looks like last year the economy started to grow again, and this year it'll continue to grow. So that's a good thing for people who have suffered so much. So the economy's changing. There's really interesting changes in how the government is acting. It's become much more conservative. in its economic policies. It doesn't admit it publicly, but they basically put in place what people call these sort of like austerity packages with immense budget cuts, immense cuts to services that go completely against all their public rhetoric of being socialists and for the people and the poor and all that. And privatizing government services, and even in the oil fields, making concessions to foreign companies, that sort of thing. So that's a difference from where things stood in 2018, 2019, even into 2020. The country's become dollarized, which means they've essentially abandoned the bolivar, and everywhere people are using dollars instead of the national currency. And then politically too, it's interesting. There were these elections in November, which I mentioned, for mayors and governorships, and against a lot of expectations, the opposition did a lot better. I mean, there were warning signs for both sides. If I'm the government, I'm very worried to see that in something like close to 20 out of 23 states, in the governor's races, my candidate won, but with less than 50% of the vote, because the opposition totaled more, even though they were running multiple candidates. If I'm the opposition, I have to recognize I could have done a lot better, and I have to stop fighting with my co-oppositionists, because that's the recipe for defeat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So signs, you said before that some things change, but they somehow stay the same at the same time. So kind of this ebb and flow. And I have a few.
Everything was different, but nothing changes.
That's yeah. It's a perfect way that you said it. So I have a few questions from the audience here I want to squeeze in before at the end of our time. So sorry, I'm just processing this question to make sure I ask it correctly. Okay, so first of all, there's the $1 million, probably more than $1 million question about, okay, so do we see an analogous state to Venezuela anywhere in the world? Like, where is this headed? Are we headed for a Cuba type situation with continuing isolation on the global stage, or now you can add Russia to that list of isolation on the global stage? Or do you see, asking you to put on the prediction hat a little bit, but where do you see all of this leading? I mean, the title of your book, they could get worse. Things are never so bad. I believe one of your Venezuelan friends said that to you, but where do you see it going, the best you can tell?
Well, it's important to think about Cuba here in the context of what's going on now with the sanctions against Venezuela. And the sanctions against Venezuela, in terms of the general economic sanctions, start under President Trump. And then when the Guaido thing happens, John Bolton, who was the national security advisor, pushes through this oil embargo against Venezuela, which has been in discussion now because they sent this group of envoys to Caracas to discuss, among other things, with Maduro, some form of lifting that to bring oil here, because we now don't get oil from Russia because of the war on Ukraine. Now, you have to ask, well, why is there an oil embargo? And the embargo was done because Bolton, who really didn't understand Venezuela or have a clear idea of what was going on here, thought that he could throw this oil embargo at Venezuela and that Maduro would be cowed and, in short order would disappear. And that didn't happen. And the risk, which some people understood in the administration, was that if you did this, it would cause a tremendous amount of economic harm to ordinary people in Venezuela, because it would deprive the country of its main source of income. And then you ran the risk that it would be permanent. So you would have another Cuba embargo situation, which is this endless embargo, which has no benefit to anybody. It doesn't change the government, and it harms the people, the ordinary people. So there's a real risk that is what plays out here. So that's one possible scenario. Everything is sort of up in the air now. I mean, Maduro for several weeks was Putin's best friend. I mean, he's essentially turned Venezuela into a client state of Russia. And when the thing started to heat up with Ukraine, he made all these public statements and speeches supporting Putin, and repeating Putin's talking points about how it's all NATO's fault, etc. Some of that may have been to get the attention of Washington, which he certainly did. But it's very hard to know how everything's going to shift at this point, because everything's in flux.
Mm. And to close us out tonight, you touch on this a little bit in the book and some of your other writing as well, but the story of Venezuela is very much a cautionary tale. There's so much in the story that for everyone in the audience, if you haven't yet read this book, we were only able to scratch just barely the surface of it. There's so much more to explore, but you talk about, this is a cautionary tale of many things, but one thing you focus on particularly is the authoritarian tendencies that we're seeing in the world now, not just in Venezuela, but in other parts of the globe as well. I mean, Russia is a great example of that. What do you see as being the lessons or the warnings that we in the US or anyone else in the world should take from this story that you have so masterfully reported?
Thank you very much. I think that the lesson, there are many lessons you could draw. One is that democracy is very fragile, and also that democracy isn't simply elections. Democracy is elections plus checks and balances and separation of powers. And so when Chavez came in, he essentially eliminated the separation of powers and got rid of the checks and balances. And he kept having elections and he kept winning elections. And then Maduro didn't have the talent or the money of Chavez. And so he had to take extra steps to do that. But by then you had all the guardrails were removed. And, Chavez didn't invent these things, but he showed that they were still viable. And you're seeing similar things all around the world. And I think the other thing is that, Chavez takes office in 99, and he was there for, how long has it been? It's been more than 20 years now with Chavez and Maduro. And so they started down this path of a deeply polarized society and electorate. And we see where it's taken them. And we're a country now that has, entered this phase of extremely deep polarization. And, we could look at them, they're very different countries in many ways, but you can look at them and say, oh, well, this is where that leads. So that's certainly something to think about.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, William, for your insight, for your reporting. Again, to everyone in the audience, the book is Things Are Never So Bad That They Can't Get Worse: Inside the Collapse of Venezuela by William Neuman. It's just out last week. So if you haven't yet gotten your copy, we encourage you to do so from Atlanta History Center so you can support this programming that we're able to bring you like tonight's wonderful talk. At the end, I couldn't have asked for William to end on a better note talking about democracy. We have a lot of democracy-themed talks and events coming up because that's a big strategic focus of Atlanta History Center, because we think that history has a role in informing a stronger democracy here in the US. If you're interested in that topic specifically, we have a panel discussion in partnership with the World Affairs Council of Atlanta on April 4th, talking about the crisis in Ukraine from folks who are historical experts in Eastern Europe, as well as the Ukrainian perspective and international affairs context. So what does that look like and how does it relate to democracy? And then later in April, we're hosting several great authors, including Cynthia Tucker, former longtime Atlanta Journal-Constitution editor, and Yashka Monk talking about populism. There's the word. So if populism is something that interested you, that William talked about, please check out that talk on May 10th. But William, again, thank you so much for joining us virtually at Atlanta History Center. We really appreciate it. And I hope we're able to talk with you again soon.
Thank you very much, Claire. I want to thank you and everybody at Atlanta History Center and all the people who tuned in, logged in for the talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.